Hello, everyone. We all know the rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It is a story carved into the bedrock of our history, a tale of a brave navigator, a visionary who challenged the flat earth believers and stumbled upon a new world. We see statues of him, celebrate a holiday in his name. He is the great discoverer, the man who connected two halves of the planet. But what if that story, what if the hero of the story is actually the villain? Forget the story of discovery. This is a story of conquest. It is a tale of a prophecy of doom whispered on a tranquil Caribbean island, a prophecy that began the day three strange ships, like floating mountains with white wings, scarred a perfect blue horizon. For the people who watched them approach, they weren't the symbols of a new age. The story of Christopher Columbus is not about a man who got lost and found a continent. It's about a man who was driven by a single burning obsession that would unleash hell on earth. And to understand it, we have to look past the sanitized portraits and into the man's own words, into the darkness that lurked in his heart long before he ever saw the shores of the Americas. He wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for gold, and he would get it. This is the story of how the paradise found became a paradise lost, and how the arrival of one man set in motion the near, total annihilation of a people, a catastrophe so vast it is almost impossible to comprehend. This is the brutal truth of how 90% of the Native Americans vanished. The people who first saw Columbus's ships approach from the sea were the Taino. For 1,000 years, they had lived in They were a sophisticated people of farmers, fishermen, and artists. Their society was built on principles of community and generosity. They had no concept of private property in the European sense. They had no iron, no swords, no guns. Their world was one of sun, sea, and tranquility. So imagine the scene on that fateful morning of the 12th of October. 1492, a man who had spent his life not canoes, not birds, but three colossal structures gliding on the water, their huge white sails catching the wind like the wings of monstrous birds. From these floating hills emerged men unlike any they had ever seen. Men covered head to toe in strange, hard shells, their faces hidden behind thickets of hair, their skin pale as if they'd never seen the sun. They carried sticks that spoke with thunder. To the Taino, these beings could only be one thing: visitors from the sky, gods or the messengers of gods. They approached the strange beings with reverence and curiosity. They brought gifts, parrots, spears, balls of spun cotton. They offered everything they had. They were, in the words of Columbus himself, so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. He wrote in it, to the contrary, they offered to share with anyone. This generosity, this openness, would be their undoing because Columbus and his men did not see people. They saw tools. They saw an opportunity. In his journal, on the very first day of contact, Columbus's mind was already racing with the possibilities of exploitation. He wrote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever." He noted their peaceful nature not with admiration, but with tactical assessment. "They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance." He saw their lack of iron as a weakness to be exploited, their generosity as a flaw to be capitalized upon. And above all, he saw one thing that eclipsed everything else: tiny, glittering ornaments of gold. That was the word that echoed in his mind, the purpose of this entire, desperate voyage. You have to understand, Columbus wasn't some enlightened Renaissance explorer seeking knowledge. He was a deeply ambitious, deeply religious, and deeply flawed man on the verge of failure. He had spent years begging the courts of Europe to fund his mad scheme to sail west to reach the East Indies. Everyone knew the world was... The experts were right. Columbus was wrong. He had drastically underestimated the circumference of the earth. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, he and his crew would have starved to death in the middle of a vast, empty ocean. His voyage was a last-ditch gamble funded by the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had just finished a costly war to expel the Moors from Spain. Their treasury was empty. They didn't fund Columbus for discovery. They funded him as a high-risk investment. They wanted a direct sea route to the fabled riches of Asia, the gold, spices, and silks described by Marco Polo. Columbus had promised them mountains of gold, his life, his reputation. His very future depended on finding it. So when he saw those small pieces of gold on the Tarfeno, he believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia, perhaps Japan, or Cipangu, as he called it. These islands, he thought, must be just off the coast of China, and where there was some gold, there had to be more. He began to sail from island to island, kidnapping natives to act as guides, desperately searching for the source. The great gold mines, he was convinced, were just over the next horizon. He wrote letters back to He described a land of impossible wealth, of harbours that could hold all the navies of Christendom, of people so docile they were begging to be converted to Christianity, and more importantly, to become tax-paying subjects of the crown. He was painting a picture, creating a sales pitch to secure funding for his next, much larger voyage. He needed to prove his gamble had paid off. But as the weeks turned into months, the gold the Tarfeno possessed was alluvial, panned from rivers in small quantities over generations. There were no golden cities, no vaults overflowing with treasure. There was only paradise, and paradise wasn't profitable. The frustration among his crew grew. They hadn't crossed the terrifying, unknown ocean for parrots and cotton. They wanted riches. The tension. Then, on Christmas Eve, disaster struck. The flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a coral reef off the coast of the island Columbus, named Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The ship was lost. Columbus was now stranded, with too many men and not enough ships to take them all back to Spain. In his mind, it was a sign from... He wrote that it was divine providence, so that he would leave a settlement there to trade and find the source of the gold. With the help of the local Tarfeno chief, Guacanaga Fay, who wept at Columbus's misfortune, the Spanish salvaged the timbers of the Santa Maria and built a crude fort. They called it La Navidad, the Nativity, because of the day it was founded. Columbus chose 39 of his men to stay behind, with instructions to trade peacefully with the natives, and most importantly, to find the location of the mythical gold mine. He promised he would return for them within the year. It was a fateful decision, one that would turn the turquoise waters of the Caribbean red. Columbus sailed back to Spain on the Naifea, a hero. He presented his evidence to the court: a few captive natives, some exotic birds, a small collection of golden trinkets, and his fantastical stories of a world ripe for the picking. It was enough. The king and queen were ecstatic. They gave him the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy and Governor of the Indies. They immediately began to outfit a second voyage. But this one would be very different. Back on Hispaniola, at the small fort of La Navidad, the 39 men Columbus had left behind were about to write the first bloody chapter of the European conquest of the Americas. They were a rough collection of sailors and adventurers, thousands of miles from home with no authority to keep them in check. The admiral's parting words about peaceful trade were quickly forgotten. They were surrounded by a people they considered subhuman. Paradise quickly turned into a crucible of greed and lust. The Spaniards, convinced of their own superiority, believed they were entitled to everything the Tarfeno possessed: their food, their women, and their gold. They roamed the island in gangs, stealing, raping, and brutalizing the local population. They forced the Tarfeno to serve them, treating them not as hosts but as... The men of La Navidad shattered the illusion that they were visitors from the heavens. They revealed themselves to be mortals, and cruel ones at that. The Tarfeno chief Guacanaga Fay, who had helped Columbus, tried to keep the peace. He urged his people to be patient, but there is a limit to patience when faced with such brutality. Other, less passive chiefs, like the powerful Kayanab Fay, watched. The Tarfeno were a peaceful people, but they were not cowards. They had their own warrior traditions. The final straw came when the Spaniards began fighting amongst themselves over their stolen gold and women, even killing one another in their squabbles. Seeing this division, and having endured months of abuse, Kayanab Fay decided to act. He united several tribes and launched a coordinated attack on the Spaniards, arrogant and disorganized, were caught completely by surprise. They were hunted down and killed. Every last one of them. The fort was burned to the ground. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola nearly a year later, in November 1493, this was the scene that greeted him. He wasn't leading 3 small rickety ships this time. He was at the head of a grand armada, 17 ships. It carried soldiers, farmers, priests, and artisans. It also carried horses, attack dogs, and weapons of war. The mission was clear: to establish a permanent Spanish colony, a trading post that would funnel the riches of the Indies back to Spain. Columbus expected to be greeted as a returning hero by his men. Instead, he found only scorched earth and the decomposing bodies of his garrison. The dream of a peaceful, profitable trading post had died. Columbus was furious. The destruction of La Navidad gave him the pretext he had been looking for, the justification he needed to unleash the full force of European military power on the people of Hispaniola. He no longer had to pretend to be a peaceful trader. He could now be what he was always meant to be, a conqueror. The age of diplomacy was over. The quest for gold, which had begun with a few trinkets, now demanded a price paid in blood. Columbus established a new settlement, Isabella, and from there he began his war. He needed to punish those responsible for the massacre at La Navidad, and he needed to pacify the entire island to control the labor force and find his gold. This began a series of brutal campaigns, which the Spanish called Spanish soldiers on horseback, clad in steel armor and wielding Toledo swords, charged into defenseless villages. They were accompanied by terrifying war mastiffs, dogs trained to hunt and kill human beings, which would disembowel a native with a single command. The Tafeno, armed with wooden spears and stone, tipped arrows, stood no chance against the iron gunpowder and cavalry of 15th century, but the random acts of terror weren't enough. Columbus needed a system. He needed to turn this island into a massive production machine for gold. So in 1495, he instituted a policy that stands as one of the most monstrously cruel systems of forced labor in human history. The tribute system: every Tafano on the island above the age of 14 was required to deliver a quota of gold every 3 months. In areas where gold was not available, they had to deliver 25 pounds of spun cotton. To keep track, every native who paid their tribute was given a copper token to wear around their neck. Any Tafeno found without a valid token was subject to the punishment decreed by the admiral. Their hands were to be cut off. They would then be sent back to their villages to bleed to death as a gruesome warning to others. As we know, there were no vast gold mines on Hispaniola. The amount of gold Columbus demanded simply did not exist. The Tafeno were forced to abandon their farms and their families to spend every waking moment desperately sifting through riverbeds for tiny specks of the yellow metal. Starvation became rampant. The social fabric of their society was completely shredded. They were working themselves to death for a system designed to kill, but they were hunted down. Others, in their despair, turned to mass suicide. They poisoned themselves with cassava juice rather than live under Spanish rule. Mothers were known to kill their own infants to spare them from the horrors of this life. The island of Hispaniola, once a vibrant home to hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people, became a landscape of horror, a vast concentration camp run by Columbus and his brothers. A Spanish priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, arrived on the island a few years later. He had initially participated in the conquest, but was so horrified by what he saw that he spent the rest of his life documenting and campaigning against Spanish atrocities. His writings give us a chilling first-hand account of the genocide. He wrote, "They made bets as to who would slit a man in two or cut off his head. They tore the babes from their mother's breast by the feet and dashed their heads against the rocks. They set up long gibbets in sets of 13 in honor and reverence of our Redeemer and the 12 apostles. And then, putting dry wood to them, they burned the Indians alive." He describes Spaniards riding on the backs of natives as if they were beasts of burden. He tells of them testing the sharpness of their blades on. This wasn't just violence in the heat of battle. This was a systematic, recreational cruelty born from a profound sense of racial and religious superiority. This was a world without consequence for the conquerors, a place where they could indulge their darkest impulses without fear of reprisal. The story only gets darker from here. If you are finding this untold history compelling, and you believe these truths need to be heard, the gold tribute system was a failure. not because it was inhumane, but because it was unprofitable. The rivers were soon panned out, the meager supply of gold exhausted. Facing the collapse of his entire enterprise, Columbus had to find a new commodity to ship back to Spain, a new way to justify the massive investment in his colony. He found his answer in the people themselves. If he couldn't find gold, in 1495, Columbus rounded up 1,600 Taíno men, women, and children. They were herded into pens like cattle from this group. He selected the 500 best specimens to be shipped to Spain and sold as slaves in the markets of Seville. They were crammed into the holds of his ships, chained and miserable. The voyage across the Atlantic was horrific. Nearly 200 of them died en route. The rest arrived in Spain sick and terrified, to be sold like livestock. This marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, while Queen Isabella was initially displeased, claiming her new subjects could not be enslaved. This was a legal nicety that was easily bypassed. The Spanish crown decreed that any native captured in a just war, which meant any native who resisted Spanish authority. Since resistance was inevitable, this gave the colonists a blank check to hunt and capture anyone they pleased. The great manhunts began. Spanish slave raids became the primary economic activity on Hispaniola. Soldiers on horseback would sweep through the countryside, descending on villages, killing the men who resisted and capturing the women and children. The island became a hunting ground. With the men killed or enslaved and the women taken as concubines by the Spanish, the Taíno could no longer reproduce. Their society was dying not just from violence, but from a complete inability to continue its existence. The farms lay fallow, the villages fell silent. The population began to plummet at a terrifying rate. It is estimated that when Columbus arrived, the population of by 1502, just 10 years later, it may have been down to 100,000. By 1514, a Spanish census recorded only 22,000 Taíno left. By 1542, Las Casas wrote that fewer than 200 were still alive. Today, the Taíno people as a distinct, full-blooded cultural group are extinct. What happened on Hispaniola? It was the model for conquest that would be replicated across the Americas by men who followed in Columbus's wake. Men like Cortés in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru. The strategy was simple: arrive, claim the land for Spain, demand gold, and if it is not forthcoming, enslave or kill the local population. Columbus wasn't just a murderer. He was an innovator of genocide. But even the sword, the attack dog, and the slave pen were not the most effective killers that Columbus and his men brought with them. The most devastating weapon they unleashed was one they couldn't see, one they didn't even know they were carrying. It was an invisible army that marched ahead of them, a biological holocaust that would dwarf the direct killing in its scale and efficiency. This weapon was disease. The Americas had been isolated from the rest of the world. During that time, the peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa had lived in close proximity to domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats. This proximity gave rise to a host of zoonotic diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague. Over centuries, Eurasian populations had developed immunities to these diseases. They became childhood illnesses but for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had no history of these infections, these germs were an apocalyptic force. They were what epidemiologists call a